Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Peck, manager of the Shad Gallery of Biodiversity and a member of the Great Wales Up Close and Personal curatorial team. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the ROM sits on what has been the ancestral lands of the Wendat, of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, since time immemorial to today. And I greatly admire their connection to the land and their practice of sustainability. I'm delighted you could join us today for ROM Connects program produced in support of our original exhibition, Great Wales Up Close and Personal, open now until March 30th, 2022. Thank you to lead exhibition patron Nita and Don Reed and family, and supporting sponsors Newfoundland and Labrador Tourism for making this exhibition possible. We would also like to acknowledge the support of our Royal Exhibition Circle donors. It is my pleasure today to welcome our guest for today's conversation, Myra J. Hurd, who is a professor, elected fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and Queen's National Scholar in the School of Environmental Studies at Queen's University, Canada. Professor Hurd is Director of Waste Flow, an interdisciplinary research project focused on waste as a global scientific, technical, and socio-ethical issue. She has recently published the book, Canada's Waste Flows, with McGill Queen's University Press, and her 11th book, The Public Sociology of Waste, is forthcoming with Bristol University Press. I encourage you all to submit your thoughts and questions via the chat feature during the program, and there will be an opportunity to answer some of these questions at the end. Please join me in welcoming Myra J. Hurd.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mark, for that generous introduction, and thank you, Erin, for organizing this presentation. I'm going to pull up my my presentation slides, so just bear with me as I share these. So, the title of my talk today is Microplastics and Canada's Waste Crisis. And before I get going, as the beginning of my presentation, I want to acknowledge that I am a settler Canadian who benefits from ongoing settler colonialism. Queen's University, where I work, is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, and I am very grateful to work and learn on this land. Okay, so here's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk for 30 to 40 minutes, and then I would be very happy to answer questions and to the best of my ability, and to discuss anything that interests you. So here's what I'm going to talk about in today's presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about Canada's waste in context. I'm then going to talk about the problem of microplastics as part of a larger plastics problem. I'm going to talk about the way that we govern waste in Canada, or the way in which we manage our waste, with a particular emphasis on recycling and what is wrong with recycling as the current big way that we manage our waste. And then I'm going to conclude with some solutions, with some thoughts. Okay, so let's get going. So here's Canada's waste in context. We are the world's highest per capita municipal solid waste producer in the world. We produce more municipal solid waste. That's the waste that we produce as individuals, as households, as families. That waste that we touch every day, that we're putting in the garbage can and then is getting, whisked away from outside our apartment buildings, outside our homes. And we produce more of this than any other country in the world, more than China, more than the United States, more than France, more than the United Kingdom. We're producing over 35 million tons of municipal solid waste per year. Most of this waste is landfilled. In Canada, our preferred way of dealing with waste is to landfill it. And we have landfills all across the southern parts of Canada. So from Victoria to St. John's, Newfoundland, we have landfills all over our provinces, and we use them. The waste that we don't landfill, we tend to export it, which I'll talk about that in a little while. There are a lot of problems with exporting our waste. We are increasingly, in fact, exporting our waste, mostly to the United States, but also much further afield to Malaysia and other countries. A lot of our landfills are reaching or have actually surpassed their engineering capacity. That is, we're filling them up to the brim, to their maximum capacity. For instance, in Ontario, the Ontario Waste Management Association has estimated that in 2,626 days, that's around 7 years, all of Ontario's landfills will be full. And municipalities are scrambling, not just in Ontario, but across Canada, to site and build more landfills. There are a few waste to energy facilities or incinerators across Canada, not many. Very few of them are actually in operation. We don't tend to use incinerators in Canada. We, as I said, landfill. Okay, so but this is interesting. So we produce a lot of municipal solid waste, but it's actually a tiny fraction of our waste footprint in Canada. This comes from human activity in the environment, which was a report put out by Statistics Canada, and this shows the major categories of solid waste that we are producing over various years. You can see from this chart that by far and away the most waste produced in Canada is from mining, from resource extraction. So if you add up oil sands tailings, which from the Alberta oil sands, which has its own category, it's so big, mine tailings and mine waste rock, this accounts for the vast majority of waste that Canada produces. Whenever you hear that question, what makes Canada Canada? From an environmental perspective, it is unquestionably resource extraction. The next biggest category is livestock manure, or which is the main part of agricultural waste. And you can see that the municipal solid waste is actually the smallest category of the waste that we produce. So this means that most of the waste that we produce in Canada isn't the waste that we as individuals, as consumers, as families, as households is producing. It accounts for at most 2.6% of the total waste that we are producing. It doesn't factor in construction waste, demolition waste, institutional waste, by which I mean things like universities, schools, hospitals, and it doesn't include military waste. So actually 2.6 is a very generous statistic. It's actually lower than that when you add in like all the waste from construction or all the waste that our military produces. So another thing that we need to keep in mind is that a lot of the waste that we as individuals and families and households are producing are actually manufacturing waste that's just been, as it's called, externalized to us. We've been given responsibility for this because most of the plastic waste that we produce is actually packaging. So we want to buy, I don't know, a television, and it comes with a huge amount of packaging. We don't want the packaging, we want the product, but we assume responsibility for that packaging. Yeah. So it's really important for us to understand what's going on in Canada, why we're in the waste crisis that we're in, to understand who is actually producing our waste. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about plastics now, because plastic is a particularly from an environmental perspective, a particularly pernicious form of waste. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So, as I just said, about 60% of everything that we are producing as consumers, all the waste that we produce, is packaging. And a lot of that packaging is plastic. Yeah. A recent report was published that kind of sent shockwaves across the waste researcher community in Canada, because it found that only 9% of plastics are recycled in Canada. The vast majority of plastics are not recycled in Canada. Even though we're putting them in the recycling bin, they're not being recycled. As well, plastics have they're not endlessly usable, as we all know, right? I mean, the obvious example would be plastic bags that we get at grocery stores, but many plastics, they don't last more than 35 years, right? Or that, right? And they take much more than a generation to decompose. Yeah. And when I say decompose, this means really that the plastics aren't disintegrating entirely. They're being made smaller and they're degrading into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces until we get microplastics, which are defined as any plastics that are less than 5 millimeter in diameter. Yeah. According to the World Economic Forum, a truckload of plastics are being dumped in the world's oceans every minute of every day. And it's for this reason that the United Nations declared ocean plastics to be a planetary crisis. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side here, you can see that plastics production is dramatically increasing. Plastics were invented in the 1800s. They really didn't come into play significantly at a global scale until the 1950s. But since the 1950s to now, they have our production of them and our use of them have very dramatically increased. Plastics are a problem for many reasons, for the reasons of toxicity, for the reasons of contamination, for their proliferation, and also because plastics are connected to climate change. Whether we're talking about the extraction of oil and gas, of petroleum that is used to make plastics. We have this term plastics, which is actually this umbrella term that refers to a whole lot of different polymers, and they derive from oil and gas. So whether we're talking about the extraction of the resources we need to make the plastic, to their transportation to the factories that are transforming petroleum into these various plastics, whether we're talking about that refining of petroleum and then the manufacture of the plastics, whether we're talking about end of life, where these plastics are being landfilled and emitting greenhouse gas emissions, at all stages of the life of a plastic bottle or whatever we're talking about, there are environmental costs which are contributing to global warming. Let's talk about microplastics. Microplastics is a new area relatively new area of environmental research. We don't know very much about microplastics. There are researchers around the world who are furiously studying microplastics, but to date, we know very little about microplastics. We don't actually know a lot about plastics. We still have a lot to learn about the endocrine disruptors, etc., the effects of plastics on human health and the environment. We know even less about microplastics. So as I noted before, microplastics are all those plastics that are 5 millimeters, less than 5 millimeters in diameter. So they're very, very tiny. And we break microplastics up into what are known as primary microplastics, and these tiny plastic granules. Industry likes to talk about those in terms of, say, cosmetic products like body washes that will have tiny microplastics in them, such that when you use it, it feels granular. But there are many products that have microplastics in them, and they're used at an industrial scale. There are also secondary microplastics, and these are defined as all of those microplastics that come from macroplastics just degrading. So if you think about, say, plastic fishing lines in oceans, as they degrade from being, tossed around in the ocean from sunlight, etc., as they get smaller, not disintegrate, but as they get smaller and smaller, they eventually become microplastics. So most microplastics are not produced they're not generated from consumers. They're actually generated from a relatively small number of industries, about 6 industries on this planet. And most microplastics come from land-based industries, not from fishing tackle or plastic bottles that are washing up on our oceans. They're actually coming from the land, and they're coming from a relatively small number of industries. And they're of big concern because we don't know what their short-term effects are, and we definitely don't know what their long-term effects are. Okay. We can talk. I'm not going to really talk about this in the interest of time, but if you're interested, there's a lot of chatter about biodegradable plastics. And so we want to be cautious about enthusiastically embracing what we would call this biodegradable hope. I'll just quickly say here that there's a bit of a misinterpretation or not enough knowledge about what biodegradable actually means. When industries talk about biodegradable, things, plastics break down really under very specific conditions that are met under only industrial or laboratory and definitely controlled conditions. So it's not the case. Biodegradable doesn't mean that if putting in some plastic and burying it in my backyard, and in 5 years I dig that area and that plastic isn't there. That's not what biodegradable means. So we can talk about that in the question and answer period if you're interested. Okay, let's talk about. So now we have some information about our waste, what we're producing, and we also have some information about plastics and microplastics in particular. So how are we managing our waste in Canada? Well, as you probably already know, waste and recycling has been privatized in Canada throughout the provinces, our provinces and territories. Waste management is privatized. And this has had significant repercussions. It means that waste is regulated in particular ways within an overall system of privatization. So the way our waste is managed is specifically designed, it's intentionally, what I mean is that it's intentionally designed to, one, place responsibility for waste, place the focus and therefore the responsibility of waste onto individuals and families and within the household for families, for heterosexual families. That means that it's typically the woman inside families that has responsibility for this, and more generally onto consumers. And the real focus since the 1970s has been on recycling. Well, why is this? Number one, both of these things, putting responsibility onto individuals and focusing on recycling, increases waste industry profits. And I'm going to explain that in the next slide. And secondly, because it doesn't decrease consumption and it doesn't confront production. So it's not getting at the root of the problem at all, but it's deflecting the problem. So what do I mean by this? Okay, well, we're probably all familiar with this um, this waste hierarchy. At the top is reduction. What we want to do, the best thing we can do for the environment is to reduce our waste. And at the very bottom, the worst thing we can do with our waste is to dispose it. And right just above disposal comes recycling. And sorry, the circular thing that we often see on our recycling things of those three arrows: reduce, reuse, recycle. We've somehow really forgot about reduce and mostly forgotten about reuse, and we've really focused on recycling. And that's because we've definitely been encouraged to do that. And the system is set up for disposal and recycling. So let's talk about recycling and the issues with recycling. So I'm talking about recycling from an environmental perspective, not from a cultural perspective or a social perspective, but from an environmental perspective. Recycling is very much what we would call a downstream response, which means that it's effectively, a band-aid attempting to solve the problem of a massive cut that you would have on your, let's say you've been shot in the gut and you put a band-aid on that. It's a downstream response that was created by industry and then followed through on by government. Recycling is for profit. It is privatized, which means that materials only get recycled if companies profit. So whatever municipality, all municipalities have contracted with waste management companies and recycling companies. These are often the same thing. If you look at the big waste management companies around the world, they also own the recycling. So that means they're controlling what's going to waste and what's going to recycling. So whenever you put something in your recycling bin, it doesn't mean that that's actually being recycled. It's being taken from your home and it is being put in a sorting center. And that sorting center is going to sort things for recycling or for waste, depending on whether the company that is controlling that center can make a profit from it. So if the company is very big, they can stock things like, for instance, polystyrene, which we know as styrofoam. If it's a smaller company, then it'll just go back into the disposal. So just putting something in our recycling doesn't mean at all that it's being recycled. And this can change over time. So these, the recycling materials like plastics, like metals, etc., are traded on the stock exchange. And so if the profit lowers, then whatever was going into recycling goes into waste disposal. If there's more profit to be made, they'll take it out of waste and put it in recycling. Recycling also only addresses, materially, again, from an environmental perspective, only about a third of our municipal solid waste anyway, even if we were recycling to the best of our ability. And by the way, Canadians by and large recycle very well. We have pretty good uptake in Canada. We've also got to really keep in mind this: recycling has not in any way decreased rates of resource extraction. Now, this is a bit of a complicated graph here. This is the difference. What this graph is showing is the difference in the demand for electronics, the recycling of electronics, and the capacity for us to recycle electronics. So let's look at the green, the green part. This is the green part of the graph shows the recycling potential. That if we put all of our used electronics, all those electronics that we're not using anymore, and we put them in the recycling, that's the potential. That's the top potential for recycling. Our current demand for electronics is much greater than even if we took all of the potential recyclable electronics, all of those things we put in drawers. They're called hibernating stocks because we don't quite know what to do with them. We don't want to put them in the garbage because that makes us feel bad, but we don't know where to recycle them. Even if we gathered up all of those, our current demand for electronics, for the new latest iPhone, for the, for all our laptops, etc., is much higher than our recycling potential. And this is growing. Our demand globally is growing at such an exponential that even if we recycle everything, we can't meet that demand. So this graph is really showing that with electronics, as with other things like, for instance, plastics, our demand for things are growing much higher than our recycling potential, which means that we are continuing to focus on resource extraction for all of the oil, gas, petrochemicals, and rare earth and other metals that are needed for all of this industrial production. Transporting recycling really mitigates any recycling good. You have to look at the entire life cycle of something when you're thinking about recycling it. I'm going to give you an example to illustrate this. So, where I work in Kingston, Ontario, what happens to polystyrene, I mentioned this before, is a really interesting case. So, Kingston rightly states that it recycles polystyrene. But this is what this actually means. What Kingston does, when I put polystyrene packaging in my recycling bin at home or at work, it is taken by the recycling trucks to the Kingston Area Recycling Center. It's known as CARC, where they sort it. And what they do is they store the polystyrene until there is enough of a volume, and then they put it on trucks that then drive this polystyrene to a center in North Bay, which is hundreds of kilometers away. It then undergoes a chemical process which produces its own waste, and it is shrunk to make it a smaller volume. When they get it to a smaller volume, they put it on trucks. Those trucks drive to Montreal, where then the polystyrene is put on container ships, which are then using fossil fuel, non-renewable fossil fuel, shipped to South Korea and the United States to be remade, to be used in products such as the picture frames that we would buy at the dollar store or Dollarama, which break easily, and then we put them in the garbage. So on my most recent trip to the Kingston Area Recycling Center, the update, and this was before COVID hit, was that that they were collecting the polystyrene and it was being trucked to Indianapolis. That back and forth is about 1,000 kilometers. So the CO2 emissions for those trucks and the use of non-renewable fossil fuels outweighs by far any environmental good that recycling polystyrene does. So when you're thinking about recycling, we've got to really keep in mind how far is it going. From an environmental perspective, it is significantly the case in many when we're looking at many materials. From an environmental perspective, it's better to landfill them because the landfill is much closer to the municipality than it is to recycle them. And the polystyrene example I gave, that's only two manufacturing processes. Often to manufacture to recycle requires three or more reprocessing uh, centers, which can be dotted around the globe. Recycling also has not led to a reduction in our waste. This graph was created by one of my wonderful former PhD students, Dr. Scott Lougheed, and he looked at Ontario municipalities' waste diversion per capita waste generation. And as you can see, communities that have generous recycling systems also have increased their waste generation. And we have not just my research group, but many research groups, not just in Canada, but across the globe, are hypothesizing that it's because when there are recycling provisions in a community, people think that it's a sort of a license to consume. That we can consume more things because, well, it's okay because I'll just put all this packaging in the recycling and then that's okay. So recycling basically, and I thank one of my undergraduate classes one year for putting me onto this graphic novel, As the World Burns, 50 Simple Things You Can Do to Stay in Denial. And you can see that the two well-intentioned figures on the cover are actually recycling. Recycling is a really, it's what Samantha McBride calls busyness. It's a way to sort of keep us occupied, to think that the problem is with us and that the solution lies with us. I want to suggest that the problem lies with industry, and the solution lies with us. Making it clear to our government representatives that we know that industry is the problem, and expecting our governments to hold industry responsible. So as you can see, recycling is very, very popular. These are just a few of the images. We've really been told that recycling, especially recycling plastics, and you can see these plastics are everywhere in these images, is the right thing to do, and that it is the environmentally sound thing to do. This is just, I took this from Queen's campus, where one mistake makes the entire bin garbage. This sort of hyper responsibilizing individuals to solve our waste problem. So I want to just conclude now by saying that we've really we've lost sight of what is the actual real upstream solution to waste generation, which is reduction. It isn't disposal, and it isn't recycling. It's really reduction. Oil and gas industries, when we're talking about plastics, we're really talking about oil and gas industries. They need to be very strongly regulated, and we need to be phasing out plastics where we can. I know that plastics are used in surgical operations, etc. So we need to, but we really need to be phasing out as many plastics as we can. And I should note that as oil and gas industries are talking about, and car companies, et cetera, are talking about, moving to electronic cars and hybrid cars and to decrease their oil production, they're also heavily investing in plastics production. So they're not actually reducing oil and gas production, they're just shifting the focus onto plastics. So we need to really exercise both our rights and our responsibilities as citizens, less as consumers and more as citizens, to expect our municipal, provincial, and federal levels of government to be shifting the burden of responsibility away from us and onto the industries which are creating our waste problem, and indeed our waste crisis. So I really encourage people to think of themselves less as consumers and what can they buy or not buy, but as citizens, and as citizens, we have a lot more power than we think we have in than we often think we have in demanding that our governments actually work in our service to reduce our plastics crisis and our waste crisis in general. So that's my presentation. I want to thank you very much for staying with me, I hope, and listening to this presentation. I want to say that I've gone over a lot of research. I've thrown out a lot of statistics and stuff. All of those are detailed in my book, but you can also contact me, and I'd be very happy to provide the sources of information that I've used in this presentation. Okay, that's my presentation. I'll stop my share. Thank you very much.
And thank you for a really stimulating and interesting conversation and presentation. And before we get to the questions, I do want to request that you all come down and visit the ROM special exhibitions, Great Whales Up Close and Personal, in person this fall. I'm going to ask some of the questions that you've requested. I'm going to start with my own because that's one of the benefits of being the co-host. And I read this morning that the latest tracking data found that the environment at 17% is now ranked as the top national issue, surpassing even COVID. With that in mind, do you think it is possible to end all plastic waste by the end of the decade, as the Liberals have promised?
No. um, and I often say the devil is in the details. So even let's just say in a fantasy world, from an environmental perspective, we stopped all plastic production in Canada today. On October 6th, we cease all plastics production. We still have all the plastics that we've already generated. And Canada is one country in a globe. And plastics, as we know, are circulating in our oceans, in our land, even in our air. And so even if we got rid of if we ceased our plastics production, we'd still have all the plastics that we've already produced since at an industrial scale since the 1950s. And we don't just have our plastics, we have the plastics of the globe to deal with. So it's the devil is in the details when we say that we won't have any plastics waste. It depends what we mean by that.
Okay, thanks. We've had a couple of questions. You promised to talk about biodegradable plastics, and could you sort of provide more information on that and on your opinion on compostable plastics as well? So.
Whoever asked that question, thank you very much for listening to my presentation and for asking those great questions. So, yeah, there's a lot of talk at the minute about biodegradable plastics and bio-based plastics and even chemical recycling. Chemical recycling, I've actually got one of my master students is doing a project on chemical recycling because this is one of the latest promises from industry that, we can take all of our plastics and then through a chemical processing, we can completely basically reuse them endlessly. The implication is sort of endlessly that these plastics will never degrade. Okay, the reality of all of these things are the following. Chemical recycling, we have a lot of companies that are saying that they have this technology. It hasn't been used at any kind of an industrial scale yet. Two, it requires chemical processing. That's why it's called chemical recycling. So it's yet to be demonstrated that this chemical process at an industrial scale would not create any waste. dealing with recycling always creates waste. Paper is a very good example. Paper, from an environmental perspective, is a very bad thing to recycle because it creates this toxic sludge that has to be landfilled in hazardous landfill sites. So again, the devil's in the details. Biodegradable doesn't mean, as I said, that you can sort of, we can bury it in our backyards or put it in with our composting, and then we give it a few years and it will disappear. It 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 means that it's only biodegradable, which means broken up into tinier and tinier and tinier pieces, um, using, like, in a laboratory setting. So it's in a very specific, scientifically controlled setting that the vast majority of us don't have access to. So again, we have to be careful about what it actually means compared to what is being advertised.
Great. Next one comes from Anne. What are the land-based industries? I think you said there were 6 of them that generate microplastics.
That is a very excellent question, and I don't have them to hand. So, Anne, please email me. I'm very easy to find on the internet. I'm very easy to find through Queens. Please email me, and I will email you back those. I know that one of them is Procter and Gamble, but off the top of my head, I forget what they are. I think there's about 6 of them, but I'm sorry, it slipped my mind. I know there's Procter and Gamble. I can't remember the other ones, and I don't want to waste time trying to trying to remember them. But if you contact me, I'd be very happy to send you the list.
Great. Okay. Next question. What is your opinion about reusing products, specifically plastics? It is my understanding that plastics are made more cheaply and are therefore unsafe to reuse anymore. Is that true? Can products be reused?
Another excellent question. Thank you for that. So my first response is to say that, as when you're just thinking of yourself as a consumer, to the degree that you're financially and time-wise able to, don't buy plastic. Reduce your plastic consumption. Now, this is difficult, right? Because it often means going to specialized shops and buying products that are much more expensive. And many of us are not in that kind of financial or time luxury to be able to do that. So rather than sort of chastising ourselves or otherwise beating ourselves up for not being good consumers, I think we have to give ourselves a bit of a break here, because we're not the ones who are producing all of this plastic. Yeah. There's definitely research out there that's been out there for quite a number of years now that shows that reusing things like plastic water bottles can have uh, 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 negative human health effects, in terms of seepage of various chemicals like endocrine disruptors, etc. So there's a lot of talk about, sort of not reusing plastic water bottles, that sort of thing. I would say, though, I think many of us are really unaware of just how pervasive plastics are. It's really difficult to kind of do anything. I mean, I'm holding a plastic pen here. My computer that I'm speaking to you through is largely made up of plastic, not metals, but actually plastics. My clothing, what I'm wearing today, has plastic in it. It's very difficult. These glasses are plastic. It's very, very difficult to actually purchase things that don't contain plastic. So again, with the means that any individual has, reduce the amount of plastic, but also recognizing that almost everything has plastics. They're really ubiquitous. Books have plastic in them. So they're really ubiquitous. It's very difficult to buy anything that doesn't have plastic in it.
Books have plastics. Wow. Okay. This is coming from our lead at the ROM's green team. So I have to ask this one. How do we find out if in our municipality, the material we put in the recycling is actually being recycled?
Antonia, thank you so much for asking that question, because that is fantastic. So what I always say to people is, when people get really down or like angry or just really depressed about our recycling situation, is find out in your municipality, in any given wherever we are in Canada, find out what's actually being recycled and where it's actually going. And this can be done by really just contacting your municipality. All municipalities have some sort of initial sorting station. If it's a very, very tiny community, then it's probably being trucked to a larger municipality where that's done. But it's really just a matter of simple phone calls. Or, if you have the time, go out to one of these facilities. They often give tours to school children, etc. And you can go and you just simply ask, so what are you collecting here, and what don't you collect, and where does it go after that? Now, municipalities are not legally uh, uh, they don't have to know where the recycling goes after it goes to the next port after they have collected it. But you can at least find out, and with a bit more sleuthing, you can find out the sort of chain of where things go. So something, glass might be recycled in one municipality, but the next municipality over doesn't recycle glass because it doesn't have the facility to do that, because the waste management company and the recycling companies that they have contracted with don't recycle that. So you can find out.
Okay, you touched on this briefly. Are synthetic fabrics a source of microplastics into water? Is using bags to collect these fibers and disposing of them a better solution?
Using bags versus what? I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I understand the
I think
the answer to the first question is yes, but I don't understand the second part of the question. I'm sorry.
I think it's probably related to, instead of putting them in the garbage, should we try to recycle them in other formats or something, or give them to Goodwill or that sort of idea?
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, we should know in terms of fabrics, most of the fabrics that we are donating end up getting exported to other countries because there is such a glut. There's way too much being given to, the Salvation Army, the Renaissance, the whatever those Value Village or whatever, and so they're actually either taking stuff and then putting it into sending it for disposal, or they're exporting it, which then you're looking at the transportation costs of moving all of these fabrics. So there's a real global glut on, and in fact, some countries, particularly some countries in Africa, are starting to refuse fabric donations because there's a total glut on that market. So again, um, again, if we're thinking just as consumers, then there's no need to buy new clothes at all. All our clothes could be reused, as in we can buy from Value Village and other things. No one needs to actually buy new clothes because everything is available, um, and that way we are reducing and reusing rather than kidding ourselves we're that recycling is effective.
All right. Okay, this is not going to be an easy one for you to answer. What level of government can best regulate the plastics industry?
Well, definitely provincial and federal. So, in fact, Ontario is actually in a process of taking the power and authority away from municipalities in terms of recycling, and making it a provincial authority. So municipalities are really hamstrung at the minute because of the way that we have structured waste management in Canada. The fact that we've privatized it and we've really dumped it onto municipalities to control it, etc. And municipalities typically don't have their own ways of disposing and reusing, refurbishing, and recycling. So they contract it out. And so municipalities are really hamstrung by these waste management and recycling companies. So the real power lies at the provincial level, and then at the federal level to regulate the resource extraction industries. And we have, in terms of mining, we have some of the laxest uh, mining regulations in the world, which is why Canada ranks as the number one by mining industries. It ranks as the number one place to mine because we have the laxest regulations. We think it might be countries in Africa or South America, but it isn't. It's right here in Canada. So definitely the federal level for those that kind of upper regulations, but provinces for things like recycling.
So if the provinces take away the power from the municipalities for regulation, are they promising greater regulation or just different regulation? Do you know?
Oh, well, they're promising greater regulation. Um, this is actually happening in real time. So we'll need to wait and see um, how this is all actually going to pan out in reality. So it's too early to tell how what shift, if any, uh, is actually going to happen. The promise is to regulate it better, um, but what actually is going to happen remains to be seen.
Right. Here's a good one. Do you give this kind of talk to city mayors and councilors?
Indeed, I do. I was recently invited to talk to Kingston City Council, and I have also been contacted by at the provincial level in Quebec, and quite a number of municipalities, city councils have contacted me to talk about ways of reducing and reusing. I would say, just as an addendum that connects these two different questions, is I think that in Ontario, as recycling is taken away from municipalities, for me, this presents an opportunity that I really hope municipalities will take up to start to either create or expand reuse and refurbishment programs in their communities, because there's a huge capacity there to increase those, which will reduce our. It doesn't. It it will help with our waste crisis much more than recycling will. So I'm really hoping that municipalities across Ontario are going to really strongly focus on reuse and refurbishment, and obviously reduction.
Right, right. Myra, I heard that some of the bigger grocery chains are promising to reduce the amount of plastic and packaging very shortly, and probably have already started. But how can the individual help reduce packaging? You know, we have problems with surgical disposable face masks. They are not recyclable, and the cloth face masks aren't sufficient. The popularity of 3D printers is going through the roof, and they also produce plastic. So I guess there's two questions in there. How do we ourselves reduce the packaging? And then how do we stop using some of this material that is not really very reusable?
Okay. Well, the biggest thing we can do, I mean, the biggest thing we can do is act as citizens rather than consumers, and it's to agitate at our community level, at our municipal levels, at our provincial level, and at the federal level, that actual real change happen. And this means writing letters to our members of parliament, our representatives. It means gathering in communities, and I've seen this and I've participated in this. Even in British Columbia, I helped. I gave a talk with the BC Nurses Union, who then followed up by by lobbying the provincial government. So that is our greatest power, and that is the greatest way of getting ourselves through this waste problem. Thinking as only as consumers, then again we want to purchase the least amount of plastic that we possibly can. Again, there's a big caveat to that because it's impossible in some, so don't, buy things that are used things, right? Don't buy new, buy used. Obviously in grocery stores, that's, we don't want to buy necessarily used produce, right? So if you have the financial means, then buy those reusable bags that Loblaws and other grocery chains offer for purchase. Um, Make sure that the grocery store that you use or the grocery stores that you use are aware that you are expecting them to reduce their plastics. But again, grocery stores, I've been I've certainly had discussions with small chains and big chains about the problem that they get a lot of products that already come with packaging. So again, if their consumers are telling them that they want less packaging, then they can use this as a hammer to the manufacturers who are delivering the products with more packaging. So definitely when you think about big chains, they may indeed have their own brands, and that's where to start. To start with, because that's where they have the most control. So to start with that. So if you're a consumer and you're at your grocery store, go to the manager and talk to them about how you want to see less packaging, less plastic being used with their own name brand products, whether that's Costco or Loblaws or whatever. Yeah. But again, that's going to be less powerful than uh, working as citizens and working together to lobby our levels of government.
Great. That's great information to have. Um, I have a different one here that I'm not familiar with. There are bags you're supposed to be able to put in your laundry before you wash it that collects microplastics and keeps them out of the water before being used or before being used for washing. Do they work?
Uh, um, I haven't seen I haven't seen research done on the effectiveness of this. So, for me to answer that question, I would need to see third-party research done on this that is not advertising claims. So a company could say that that does that, but whether or not it actually does, you would need to see research that's done on that by researchers who are not paid by that company. So I can't answer that question without seeing research that's actually done on that. But again, um, again, focusing on just keeping microplastics proliferate our water system. So, if just keeping them out of, say, our laundry, isn't going to solve our microplastics problem.
Right. Right. Um, Almost the final question. I'm going to save one for myself. As an educator to young children, what message would you give to children of today?
Great. Well, I have children, and we talk a lot about waste. So here's the message that I would give: that we as individuals are powerful in lending our voice to bringing our voices together into larger community and city and province, etc. voices. There are uh, there are bigger, our children can join with other children in communities that are set up to voice our concerns about waste, about climate change, etc. And that is our power. It is much less as consumers, and it's much more as people, as human beings, as citizens. As citizens, we have responsibilities, but we also have rights. And so that is, for me, that is our a huge source of power that we can harness.
Great.
And
Thanks.
it's kids that are leading the way. Let's face it, right? Like it's often our kids, the younger generation, that are really taking this on.
Yeah, and we certainly owe it to them. And just my final question is, you and I both started with a land acknowledgement. And given what we've talked about today, and what you've talked about in your book, can you briefly discuss how waste is impacting Indigenous communities throughout Canada?
That's a great question, and it's a big question. Yeah, I'm very privileged to be conducting research in Nunavut, and where waste, as it is in the Yukon, as it is in the Northwest Territories, waste is an enormous problem in Indigenous communities who do not have access nor the resources to the same kind of waste management that we have in southern communities. In Nunavut, for instance, there are no landfills. There are no working incinerators. There are massive, massive problems with open dumps, etc. But let's remember that most of the waste that we find in the Northwest Territories, in Nunavut, in the Yukon, is not produced by those communities. It is produced by industries and the military, Canadian and US militaries that are up there and that are dumping waste in communities on the landscape. Often this waste is highly toxic, PCBs, radioactive, etc., and is being left for communities that are in deep crisis and do not have the resources to deal with this waste. So for me, this is why I argue in the book that waste is a symptom of ongoing settler colonialism and needs to be seen as this.
Great. Thanks very much. Um, I just want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank Myra very much for this wonderful presentation, and I hope we'll see you all again at our next digital program. Details of all upcoming ROM at home online programs can be found on the ROM's website and through our social media channels. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you very much.